some people think, oh, political ads are so vicious, they're so negative. I mean, they say such terrible things about such candidates. And in certain senatorial campaigns, they're really vicious. And there was a campaign in North Carolina, I think, where they deliberately took a black candidate and made his skin look darker that was very subtle to make him look more black. This is nothing compared to what was done to Abraham Lincoln and Jackson's wife before that. Abraham Lincoln was compared to a monkey and an ape, and Jackson's wife was considered a whore, that she was sleeping around, I think. I mean, horrible stuff, and Jackson never forgave the party that ran against him. She died, I don't know, 2.5 or 3 months after the election, and it's thought that she was just so depressed that her, well, you imagine your name being taken through the mud in those days, and you're a woman with those kinds of attacks that almost surely were completely untrue. It's terrible stuff. One of the things that's unfortunate and insidious is that the market research and social psychological research has gotten better and better at figuring out what motivates people in ad campaigns. And we already knew this intuitively, the Greeks probably knew this, that greed and fear will motivate people more. And what people try and do, they did this with Dukakis, they try and smear the candidate, or when the candidate isn't well known ahead of time. And they tried it with Bill Clinton because he was not really very well known in 1992, is to begin to paint a picture before the public has a chance to create its own ideas about it. I mean, if the guy's been George Bush Sr. and he's been vice president for 8 years, the public knew who he was. Or Gerald Ford even for a couple years, or certainly Nixon. Jimmy Carter wasn't, but I mean, what they do is they basically use a smear tactic. Then it becomes very hard to undo that. And it's very easy also to scare people. This is other neuropsychological research that's been really developed in the last few years that shows that it's easy to scare people about the here and now, like terrorism, a drop in the stock market. That's scary. But if we talk about global warming and things that we need to look at that are far away, physically far away and time-wise far away, people aren't worried about that. They go, no, that's not going to get me. Or they'll solve it by then. Or this disease won't get me. I can smoke now. They'll have a cure. Young people think that sometimes. I do think this is good where the candidate, if they're getting money of a certain sort, they have to say at the end, I'm Hillary Clinton and I approve this ad. I mean, otherwise the person's dissociated. But these other groups, the 511 groups or whatever they are, they can run anything they want. They're very hard to trace. The swift voting kind of campaign, that's really dangerous to the body politic. There's a good book called Good Work, which has been co-written by Csikszentmihalyi, and it's a study of geneticists and journalists. And you think, well, what do they have in common? They have a lot in common. What they have in common is that the technology of their industries is moving ahead real rapidly. Geneticists are finding I'm not exaggerating, 3 new amazing discoveries like every day. Because they're saying, okay, that gene is related to Hodgkin's lymphoma, or that gene is related to Alzheimer's or something. Journalists also, everything's changing real quickly, and the economics, and we don't have a good business model anymore in print journalism, so newspapers and magazines are dying. The problem is with genetics, and particularly with genetics, but almost as much so with journalism, is the ethics haven't kept up with these technological movements, and they almost never will in genetics. I mean, we're going to have issues where you could be involved with somebody and you could be wanting to have a child, and 12 years from now there could be research out there that could say, well, with 28% accuracy, you can decide, if you're really superficial, whether my kid has green or blue eyes, and you could stop the pregnancy, I suppose, if it were made illegal. But I mean, if you have means to pay, you could stop it. A more reasonable thing is maybe you'd say, well, I don't want my kid to have this disease, potentially this disease, even though the chances are greater that he's not going to have it. But you might say, no, I don't want to risk that. I mean, we already have that with Down syndrome, of course. Frequently, we're finding new genetic clusters and things that, with greater accuracy, we know are linking up with certain maladies that a kid might have. And so then you start getting all kinds of elective abortions. I'd say use more than one source. One source isn't good enough. And maybe deliberately look at really alternative sources. The funny thing that might surprise you is that Al Jazeera, someone did a study, a good place did a study, and found that Al Jazeera's reporting wasn't that different on a lot of issues than mainstream U.S. media. That would really surprise you. Intentionally look at Fox if you're a lefty, and if you're a righty, intentionally look at MSNBC and see how they're taking the same issue and playing it and distorting it otherwise. I watch Fox, I go, oh, I didn't know that that bill might have that problem with it. I didn't remember that Bill Clinton was the guy who signed that first bill that actually has helped enable some of the economic mess that we're in. I mean, I think it's really on someone else's plate that we could point fingers toward. But so I would say look at more than one source. Be always skeptical. And always be skeptical about what motive does that media company have in putting that out there. Oh, and then the third thing I guess I would say is, what aren't they telling me? And they may not even know what they aren't telling you, because the reporters are not the best informed people in the world. But I mean, what's missing from this story? Sometimes it's very deliberately missing, like the cost of that bill. I've devoted parts of the last 20-odd years of my life to the development of media education in the United States and around the world, and in New Jersey. Media literacy is now language arts literacy requirement 3.5 in the state of New Jersey, but it's not well mandated in the state of New Jersey, which is to say that in Maryland it's mandated and followed through. I mean, they actually maybe even test on it, and all the kids are getting it. And they're doing it in Australia. The Australians, I used to say they're 30 years ahead of us. They're just a whole universe ahead of us. They're teaching semiotics to 5- and 6-year-olds. They don't call it semiotics. They're just showing kids at 5 and 6 how different kinds of glasses represent class status, like a beer mug versus a champagne glass. A 6-year-old knows that. And they build out from there. That's semiotics. That's symbolism, okay? So I've devoted myself to some degree of trying to make some change in the world about the media and addiction stuff and these kinds of things with media literacy. And what we need is for kids from kindergarten, if not even before, and it's been done and can be done in other countries, to teach kids to start being skeptical. You want them skeptical about advertising. I've got great stuff over here in my media pile that HBO created years ago, teaching 5-, 6-, 8-year-olds called Buy Me. It's called Buy Me That, and it shows kids like here's how advertising distorts. You ever get a toy home, it looks so great on TV, now you get it home, you try and put it together, it doesn't work, it doesn't fly, it doesn't do anything, the batteries weren't included. And kids love that. See, media literacy, they just eat it up because kids love to be told or to learn about the backside, you know, the hidden story of how they're being lied to. And they're not always being lied to in advertising, but that also then leads into politics. If we're going to have a real democracy like Jefferson talked about, Jefferson said that he would rather have no government and newspapers than no newspapers and government. And I think he's absolutely right. I mean, imagine government without a press. We'd be really in trouble. We'd be really in trouble. So Jefferson would have fought for media literacy. He would have said everyone should have it. And I got to say that UNESCO and the United Nations have put it down as every child's right in the world to get media education. And this has been for 10, 15 years. So, and we've got it on the books here through my center, the Center for Media Studies at Rutgers. But we're further behind. I've written a number of articles further behind every other English-speaking country in the world. They're all ahead of the United States. And part of the reason for that is because we have so much media that's indigenous, we don't realize what it's like to have media come from the outside. In Australia, in particular, they're having all of our media come in, and they got their own kids starting to wear 15 years ago, starting to have baseball caps turned sideways, and they're going, what the hell is this? We hardly have baseball. Why are kids turning their baseball cap? Oh, it's a fad from the U.S. And so they feel their own cultural integrity threatened, as do the Canadians. I mean, imagine how we would feel if most of our media was coming from Nepal, or Japan would be a better, we go, what the heck is going on here? And so those kinds of levers really push other countries. It's partly xenophobic and like, ooh, I don't like what these other countries are doing. But even aside from all that, kids and adults, if we're going to have a better world with greater democracy, we're going to follow the lines of some of the kinds of arguments that President Obama made in Egypt the other day. We got to get everybody understanding everybody else's process. And that's what causes wars. I mean, religion sometimes causes war, and political difference causes wars. And if we can understand how other groups are stereotyped, I mean, Arab and Muslim peoples are more stereotyped in this culture, and negatively stereotyped, than any other group. We need to see how other people see us, and other people need to see how they are seen and how they're seeing other peoples around the world. I mean, you can't look at all 220 countries in the world, but wars, whole wars get started by how one group has intentionally often stereotyped another group. I mean, we went in the first Persian Gulf War in 1991 because George Herbert Walker Bush was deliberately calling and comparing Saddam Hussein to Hitler. I mean, he had a mustache, he was a dictator, he gassed his own people, and all of these kinds of things. He gassed Kurds, who he may not have considered his own people. I don't know what he thought. But I want to point out that just for example, I mean, if you look at the American landscape, starting in the middle 60s, the NAACP and other groups saw to it that cartoons that were racist and depicted blacks in really awful ways, stereotypic awful ways, as being lazy and shiftless and these things, they were all pulled out of cartoons. You can't see them anymore. A few of my students have seen the famous Bugs Bunny cartoon where Bugs Bunny is in blackface, but most of them have never seen it. And that stuff was routine for what I saw when I was growing up from Warner Brothers. Then women's images started changing in the late 60s and in the early modern feminist movement in the early 70s. And then Native Americans' image and Hispanics' image. There is one last group as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure there are others, but one last group which is fairly large, and it represents 6 million Americans. And those are Arabs and Muslims, people of Arab and Muslim descent or background, who are still depicted in really horrible ways. In Disney, full-length features. In video games, where the person that you're trying to hurt is an Arab sheik or something like that. And this has to be hurtful to people in these other countries, and they can see right away, look how we're being depicted. And the people who are living here say, look how our people are being depicted. When we look at images of Osama bin Laden's training camps that show them depicting Americans certain ways or whatever, we're horrified. And we think, well, we would never do that. Well, I'm afraid we perhaps do. And what I'm saying is that if people are going to come together more in the world, and we're going to reduce the frequency with which wars break out, and have always broken out all over the world, we're going to get people to be more savvy, more intelligent about questioning where media images come from, and maybe accepting the possibility that all peoples are good, at least starting out to be good, and that if they're bad things they do, they've learned to do those things for the most part. And I'm not going to get all summer campy and we're going to start singing Kumbaya or something like that, which is interesting. The kids know that from summer camps, and it's an African lullaby, I think. I'm not sure. But anyway, we can do better, and we can do that through media literacy education, and we can do that for people understanding where media images come from.